The sound of a warship's horn echoed through the streets of Pittsburgh as Jack Thompson, a young welder, stood at the corner of Fifth Avenue, looking at the newspaper he held in his hands. The headline screamed, "Pearl Harbor attacked. America joins the war." His heart thudded in his chest. It felt as if the world had changed overnight. Jack had always been a dreamer, the kind of man who imagined the clang of steel, the hiss of molten metal, and the satisfaction of craftsmanship. But now there was no room for dreams, only the cold, hard reality of war. He shoved the newspaper into his coat pocket and walked faster, the weight of his decision settling on him. His father had been a welder too, a man who worked the blast furnaces at the steel plant, whose hands were calloused and worn by the constant grind of iron. He died of lung disease just 2 years ago, a casualty of the very job that had kept the family fed. Jack often thought his father's legacy was in every inch of steel he welded, but now that legacy had shifted. The country needed more than just welders in factories. It needed soldiers, builders, and innovators. By the time Jack reached the steel mill gates, the air was thick with smoke and the sharp scent of burning metal. The city had always been a symbol of American industrial power, but today it felt different. The energy of change was everywhere. Jack walked to the workers' quarters, where he found his crew already gathered, awaiting the morning shift. There was a sense of nervous energy in the air, whispers of men volunteering to serve their country in the military, and some even heading straight to the docks to enlist. But Jack, with his family's history in the mills, had decided differently. He would stay and work, but he would also serve in his own way. The foreman, a gruff man with a weathered face, slapped him on the back as he approached. "You here to stay, Jack? War's coming, and we're all going to have to give everything we've got." Jack nodded, his jaw clenched. He wasn't sure how much of everything was left to give. His father had given all he had, and now it was his turn. "Let's make this steel sing, son," the foreman said, his voice laced with determination. "They say we're going to need ships, planes, and tanks, and fast." Jack didn't respond. His mind raced ahead, imagining how those ships would be built. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something deeper, a call to arms. Not with weapons, but with steel. And so Jack took his first steps into the shipyard, where the war effort would demand more than he ever thought possible. The train screeched to a halt as Jack Thompson stepped onto the platform in Richmond, California. The salty air from the bay mixed with the metallic scent of molten steel. All around him, the Kaiser shipyards roared to life. Cranes clanged, sparks flew, and thousands of workers moved like a single living organism. This wasn't a factory. It was a heartbeat of war. "Thompson, you're the new welder from Pittsburgh?" a voice shouted over the din. Jack turned to see a tall man in overalls, face streaked with soot. "Yeah, that's me," Jack replied. "Then get your boots ready. This ain't no steel mill. This is a battlefield made of rivets and fire." Jack followed him past rows of unfinished ships, their hulls looming like giants. The clang of hammers echoed through the air, and he noticed how unorganized everything seemed. Piles of steel plates lay scattered, torches sputtered out from overuse, and workers shouted directions that no one followed. He'd heard about this chaos on the train, a desperate attempt by the US to outbuild the enemy. The government demanded battleships faster than anyone thought humanly possible, but from what Jack was seeing, speed came at the cost of sanity. Inside the assembly tent he met her, Eleanor Brooks, though most called her Ellie. She was in her late 20s, hair tied back under a welding cap, clipboard in hand. Her blue eyes flicked from one blueprint to another, calculating, correcting, commanding. "You're the new welder?" she asked without looking up. "Yes, ma'am," Jack said. "Good. We're not riveting anymore." "We're welding." Jack frowned. "Welding on ships this size?" Ellie finally looked at him, her tone sharp but confident. "If we can weld faster than we can rivet, we can build ships in half the time. Maybe save lives in the Pacific. That's the plan." Jack hesitated. Welding this kind of steel wasn't just risky, it bordered on impossible. The heat distortion alone could ruin the structure. But before he could speak, Ellie cut in again. "Don't worry, you'll learn, we all will." As Jack took his first torch in hand, he noticed the veterans watching him, their expressions half amusement, half doubt. They'd been riveting ships for decades, and they didn't trust change. Ellie turned to the group, voice steady. Gentlemen, the old ways won't win this war. The room fell silent, the only sound the hum of electricity and the hiss of flame. Jack swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if he'd come to build ships or to watch history burn itself into steel. The heat from the welding torches was oppressive, almost suffocating, but the real weight pressing down on Jack was the failure of their first attempt. The steel plates had cracked in the test, and the seams they welded were far from strong. Jack wiped the sweat from his brow, his arms aching. Ellie stood beside him, her eyes scanning the damage with a calculating gaze. "I knew it," Jack muttered, frustration bubbling up. Welding at this scale was too much. We're doomed to fail. Ellie, however, didn't seem to share his doubts. She was methodical, deliberate, her mind always 2 steps ahead. "No, we just need to rethink how we're doing it." Jack raised an eyebrow. "How do you mean?" "You're thinking like a welder, Jack. I need you to think like an engineer." Ellie turned to the others gathered around the broken hull. "We've been using the same approach that works on smaller jobs, but this ship is a different beast." Her eyes gleamed, almost wild with inspiration. "What if we didn't just weld the seams? What if we used welding to hold everything together in a different way? What if we used it for the joints, not just the surface?" Jack frowned, unsure of what she was suggesting. "You mean instead of riveting, we just weld it all?" "Exactly," Ellie said. "Rivets take time. They're labor-intensive, but welding could be quicker, stronger, more efficient. We can join metal faster, and we won't have to stop for every joint. It's going to change everything." Jack felt a surge of hope, but doubt was quick to follow. "But the heat distortion—" Ellie shook her head, cutting him off. "We adjust, we fine-tune the technique. This is going to be the future. The kind of future that's going to win us this war." She looked around at the group. "We're not just welding metal here. We're building a nation's future, and we need to get it right." The workers were skeptical, but Ellie's conviction was contagious. Jack could see it, the dawning realization that they weren't just part of a factory, they were part of something bigger, something that could change the tide of the war. "I'm in," Jack said, determination hardening his voice. Ellie nodded. "Good. Now let's get to work. This ship isn't going to build itself." And just like that, Jack found himself on the edge of something revolutionary. The weeks that followed were a blur of sweat, sparks and steel. The air in the shipyard was thick with the smell of burning metal, a constant reminder of the weight of their mission. Jack's hands were raw from the heat of the torches, his skin cracked and calloused. But the work didn't stop. They had a deadline now, and every day that passed felt like a race against time. Jack was working alongside Luis Ramirez, a Mexican-American welder who had been at the yard for nearly 3 years. Luis was older than Jack, but the two of them quickly became friends, and Luis shared everything he knew about welding. His hands were fast, precise, and Jack admired the ease with which he handled the torch. Every time Jack struggled, Luis was there to offer advice, a steady hand, or a word of encouragement. "It's not about muscle, hermano," Luis would say, his voice steady as he guided Jack's hand. "It's about feeling the metal. Let it talk to you." Jack tried to listen, tried to understand the rhythm Luis spoke of, but there was so much to learn, and the clock was always ticking. The tension was palpable, not just between the workers, but from the weight of the world pressing down on them. The stakes were higher now. They were no longer just building ships, they were building the hope of a nation. In the evenings, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the shipyard came alive with a different kind of energy. The workers would sit in small groups, drinking coffee and sharing stories of their homes. Some talked about their families, others about the friends they'd lost to the war. It was a hard life, but there was a bond here, a brotherhood that went beyond nationality, beyond the color of skin. Jack found himself sharing stories too, ones he hadn't thought about in years. He talked about his father, about how he had taught Jack everything he knew about welding. "My father would have been proud of this," Jack confessed one evening, as he watched a ship's hull take shape in the distance. Luis nodded, his face solemn. "Our fathers would have been proud, but we're doing something bigger now. We're making history." As the days passed, the work became harder. They welded through the night, trying to keep up with the pressure to build faster, stronger, and with fewer mistakes. Every flaw in the welds was a failure, and the mistakes started to add up. Some welds broke, some joints didn't hold, and every time that happened, Jack could see the doubt creeping into the eyes of the others. But Ellie wouldn't let them falter. Every mistake was an opportunity to learn. "We'll fix it," she said, her voice unwavering. "We'll do it right." And somehow they did, but not without sacrifice. Jack's back ached, his body felt broken, but when he stood back and saw the first full section of the ship holding together, that was all the motivation he needed to keep going. By mid-spring of 1942, the shipyard buzzed with a strange mixture of fatigue and stubborn optimism. Weeks of trial and failure had burned away the arrogance of old habits, leaving behind something leaner, tougher, and more determined. The air smelled of hot iron and salt, and the clang of hammers was like a relentless heartbeat, the pulse of a nation trying to outbuild a war. Ellie stood before a set of massive welded plates, her gloves blackened with soot. Jack and Louise were beside her, eyes fixed on the shimmering line of the new joint design. They had adjusted the welding angle, reduced heat distortion, and added staggered seams to balance stress. It was all theory, until now. "All right," Ellie said, her voice hoarse but steady. "Let's test it." A crane lifted the welded section, its chains creaking as it hung suspended. The inspectors stepped forward, tension thick in the air. For weeks, every test had ended in disaster, cracks splitting through the seams like lightning through glass. But this time the metal held firm. Not a groan, not a fracture, just silence. Then came the sound, a metallic thud as the section settled safely back onto the ground. The weld had held. Luis exhaled first, a wide grin spreading across his face. Dios mío. It worked. Jack laughed, disbelief and relief crashing through him all at once. "We did it, we actually did it." The workers nearby erupted in cheers. Some clapped each other on the back, others raised their helmets high. Ellie stood still, taking it in, her expression a rare mix of triumph and exhaustion. For a brief moment, the endless grind of war felt far away. "This changes everything," Jack said quietly. Ellie nodded, eyes shining beneath the grime. "It does. Now we can build ships faster, maybe even save lives before the enemy takes them." But amid the celebration, whispers began to ripple through the shipyard. Some of the older supervisors looked uneasy. A few men muttered about the new method being dangerous, untested, un-American. Rumors spread that rival contractors had been complaining to Washington, that the innovation threatened established industries and profits. Jack caught one of the older welders glaring at them from across the yard. "Looks like not everyone's happy about progress," he said. Ellie's gaze hardened. "Then we'll prove them wrong, one weld at a time." Jack smiled faintly. "And we'll make history while we're at it." The days blurred together as the pressure mounted. The project had become more than just a shipbuilding effort. It was a symbol of hope for a nation at war. With every passing hour, the stakes grew higher. Washington had made an urgent demand: assemble a battleship in 3 days to showcase this new welding technique to the world. The impossible deadline hung over them like a dark cloud, threatening to suffocate everything they had worked for. Jack could feel the weight of it every time he picked up his torch. There was no margin for error, no room for failure. The yard was a hive of frenzied activity, with workers rushing to complete their sections, welders moving faster than ever before, and cranes lifting massive steel plates with a sense of urgency that matched the ticking of the clock. Ellie paced back and forth, her mind constantly running through the sequence of steps needed to pull this off. She was everywhere at once, overseeing the placement of steel, adjusting the welding angles, inspecting the seams. Her focus was unwavering, but Jack could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the quiet moments of doubt when she thought no one was watching. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this pace up," Jack muttered one evening, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted his welding mask. The blisters on his palms were already deep and painful. Ellie looked at him, her face as tired as his. "We don't have a choice, Jack. We have to make it. For the men overseas, for everyone who believes in this country." But even her words couldn't mask the tension creeping in. They were all operating on fumes, physically drained, mentally exhausted, and terrified that one wrong move would cost them everything. As the hours passed, more and more of the ship's skeleton came together. The plates were welded quickly, and for the most part the new method held. But the noise, the heat, the constant pressure, it was all starting to get to Jack. He would catch himself zoning out for a moment, lost in the endless sound of torches and hammers, only to be snapped back to reality by the urgency in Ellie's voice. "We're almost there," she would say, rallying the workers each time they hit another obstacle. "We just need to keep going. One more section. One more weld." But even as the final pieces of the ship began to take shape, Jack couldn't shake the fear that they were running on borrowed time. He had seen workers collapse from exhaustion. Others had lost their focus and made mistakes, creating delays that sent everyone into a frenzy to make up for lost time. There was no stopping now. It wasn't just about welding steel anymore. It was about proving that they could do what seemed impossible. By the second week of the rush order, the shipyard no longer slept. Floodlights bathed the steel skeleton of the battleship in an endless artificial day, and the workers moved like clockwork, shifts overlapping, torches glowing, hammers clanging in rhythm. The place had become a living organism, every man and woman a vital cell in its beating heart. Jack could feel it, the pulse of America itself in every spark that flew. But even that sense of unity couldn't hide the exhaustion carved into everyone's faces. Their backs ached, their hands blistered, and yet no one quit. Because quitting meant slowing the war. He leaned against a beam for a brief moment of rest, watching the women on the assembly line across the yard. They worked fast, faces streaked with grease and sweat. Some were mothers, some teenagers fresh out of school, but all wore the same determined expression. One of them waved at Jack, a small gesture, but it carried something powerful, solidarity. Ellie walked up behind him, clipboard in hand. "You look half dead, Thompson," Jack chuckled weakly. "Feels about right. You look worse," she smirked. "That's the price of leadership." Her voice was rough, but there was a warmth beneath it, a kind of mutual respect forged by fire. They'd stopped being engineer and welder. Now they were soldiers in the same battle. "How's the crew holding up?" she asked. Jack glanced around. "Barely, but they'll keep going. They've got pride now. You gave them that." Ellie shook her head. "No, they gave it to themselves. We're just giving them a reason." Later that night, a minor fire broke out near one of the power lines. Panic spread fast, but before the supervisors could react, workers rushed in with extinguishers, putting it out within minutes. When the smoke cleared, a cheer went up, spontaneous, unplanned, defiant. Jack found himself shouting too, his throat raw. In that instant, he understood something. The shipyard wasn't just steel and sparks. It was people, tired, flawed, determined people who refused to surrender. Ellie's voice rose above the noise. "This is what America looks like." And she was right. Immigrants, women, veterans, and dreamers all welded together, not just by metal but by purpose. Jack turned back to his torch, heart pounding. "Let's make this ship breathe," he murmured. "Let's make it live." And the shipyard roared back to life. The night shift had settled into its usual rhythm, a dim hum of lights, the crackle of torches, and the steady clanking of metal against metal. The workers moved in sync, like gears in a well-oiled machine, each person knowing exactly what had to be done, each action deliberate and focused. The air was thick with smoke and the constant buzz of electricity. It was late, but there was no time for rest. They were on the edge of something monumental, and every second counted. Then, without warning, the sharp screech of metal tearing apart split the air. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He turned, looking toward the sound. The power lines above the shipyard had short-circuited, sending sparks flying, igniting the oil-soaked wood and tar that had accumulated on the factory floors. Flames leapt into the air. "Fire!" someone screamed, panic in their voice. Within seconds, chaos erupted. Workers scrambled for fire extinguishers, shouting orders to each other, but the flames spread quickly. Jack felt the heat on his face as he ran toward the source of the fire, adrenaline pumping through his veins. This was no drill. This was real. The entire shipyard could go up in flames, and with it their progress. They couldn't afford that. Not now. Not when they were so close. Ellie was already there, her face streaked with soot, eyes wide but focused. She grabbed a fire extinguisher from a nearby worker and began spraying the flames, her hands steady despite the chaos. Jack joined her, pushing through the smoke, working side by side with people he barely knew, but now trusted with his life. The heat was unbearable, and Jack's lungs burned with every breath, but he didn't stop. There was no time for fear. There was no time for doubt. "Hey, you can't stop this," a voice shouted. It was the foreman rushing toward them, his face pale with fear. "We need to evacuate. The whole yard's gonna burn." But Ellie didn't even look up. "We finish this or we all lose," she said, her voice calm amidst the madness. "If we let this fire win, we lose everything, all of it, so keep fighting." And fight they did. Jack watched in disbelief as together they managed to quell the flames, pushing them back until the fire was reduced to smoldering embers. The damage was done, but the shipyard still stood. The battleship was still intact. They had saved it. Breathing heavily, Jack looked at Ellie, their eyes locking for a moment, understanding passing silently between them. It was more than just welding metal now. They were fighting for something far bigger. "We keep going," Jack said, his voice hoarse but determined. Ellie nodded, a small, grim smile tugging at her lips. "We keep going." The morning after the fire, the shipyard was a landscape of soot and silence. The smell of burnt oil lingered in the air, and blackened metal still steamed under the rising sun. Yet despite the exhaustion and damage, no one spoke of giving up. Instead, there was a quiet defiance among the workers, a shared understanding that if they could survive that night, they could survive anything. Jack stood near the still smoking hull, rubbing the back of his neck. His muscles ached, his lungs burned, and his clothes were stiff with grime. But beneath the fatigue, there was a strange feeling brewing inside him, something like pride. Ellie walked toward him, holding a stack of blueprints that looked like they'd been through hell and back. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was steady. "We can't afford another night like that. If we're going to meet this deadline, we need to do more than fix what's broken. We need to change how we build." Jack frowned, glancing at the ship. "Change? We're already pushing the limits. What else can we do?" Ellie spread the drawings across a metal workbench, her eyes alight with determination. "We've been building this ship piece by piece like a puzzle. That's too slow. What if we build sections, modular parts, all at once and weld them together later?" Jack studied the sketches, his brow furrowed. "Like how the auto factories work." "Exactly," Ellie said, her excitement growing. "They build cars in parts, frames, doors, engines, and then assemble them at the end. If we apply that same logic to ships, we can cut time in half." Jack looked skeptical. "Ships aren't cars, Ellie. We're dealing with steel plates the size of buildings." "Then we'll make the shipyard work like a factory," she said firmly. "We'll rewire the entire process if we have to. We'll train crews to specialize, some on the hull, some on the decks, others on the internals, each team working in parallel." Jack couldn't help but smile. "You really think it'll work?" Ellie met his gaze. "I know America's greatest weapon isn't just its soldiers, it's its workers, people like us." For the first time in weeks, Jack felt a surge of real hope. The war had forced them to innovate, to evolve beyond what they thought possible. He looked back at the ship and said quietly, "Then let's show them what American hands can do." By the time the new modular system was in motion, word of the 3-day Battleship Challenge had spread far beyond the shipyard. Newspapers called it madness. Radio hosts debated whether it was a patriotic miracle or an impossible stunt. Soon, reporters and photographers began arriving from across the country, their flashbulbs cutting through the fog of the bay. America was watching and waiting for them to fail. Jack felt the pressure like a weight on his chest. Everywhere he turned, there were strangers in suits with notebooks, taking notes, snapping pictures, whispering to each other. It wasn't just about steel anymore. It was about pride. One mistake would be front-page news. Luis clapped him on the shoulder as they stood near the hull, their torches ready. "You see all those cameras?" he said with a grin. "They came to watch us break. Let's make them watch us win instead." Jack smiled weakly, but his stomach churned. The schedule was relentless, and fatigue was a constant enemy. Ellie had divided the yard into zones, each one responsible for a different section of the ship. The new process was efficient, but the pace was brutal. There was no room for hesitation, no margin for error. Every few hours, Ellie made rounds, checking welds, adjusting plans, motivating the exhausted crews. Her voice carried through the yard, firm but encouraging. "Every inch we finish brings us closer. Keep going. You're making history." Then disaster nearly struck. A sharp cry cut through the noise. Luis had dropped his torch, clutching his hand in pain. Jack rushed over, heart pounding. The skin on Luis's palm was burned, the glove scorched. "Get me back to work," Luis said through gritted teeth, trying to stand. Ellie knelt beside him. "You need a medic. That's an order." Luis shook his head. "No, I can still hold a torch. You're not finishing this ship without me." The defiance in his voice silenced everyone around. Ellie hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Fine, you stay. But you take it slow." The men helped Luis wrap his hand, and within minutes he was welding again. Slower, careful, but determined. Jack couldn't help but stare in awe. It wasn't just patriotism or duty that kept them going now. It was something deeper, a shared belief that what they were doing mattered. The cameras could record all they wanted. What they couldn't capture was the heartbeat behind every spark. The second day began before the first had truly ended. The shipyard was drenched in fatigue, faces smeared with soot, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. Yet the work never stopped. Every welder, every riveter, every crane operator moved like a soldier on the front line. They were fighting a different kind of war, one measured in inches of steel and hours lost to exhaustion. Jack's hands trembled as he guided his torch along the hull, the heat scorching through his gloves. The world had narrowed to sparks and metal, the roar of machinery deafening everything else. He had stopped feeling his legs hours ago. All that kept him going was Ellie's voice echoing across the yard. "Stay sharp. Every weld counts." By midday, the pressure was unbearable. The Navy inspectors walked through the site with clipboards and stopwatches, muttering among themselves. The camera crews kept snapping pictures, waiting for the slightest sign of collapse. Ellie paced behind them, her jaw tight, her fingers gripping her clipboard so hard the paper tore. Then, without warning, a sharp metallic crack cut through the chaos. The sound froze everyone. A weld line, one of the main seams, had failed under stress. The steel split open like a wound. Jack dropped his torch, running toward the damaged section. His heart pounded in his chest. "No, no, no," he muttered. Ellie was already there, her face pale but controlled. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough," Jack said. "If we don't fix it now, it'll spread." Ellie looked at him, eyes fierce. "Then we fix it. Right now." For a moment, everyone stood frozen. Then Ellie's voice snapped like a whip. "Shift leads. Reassign half the crew here." "Jack, you're with me." The workers jumped into motion, sparks flying again. The failed section became a storm of torches, sweat, and shouting. Jack's arms screamed with pain as he re-welded the seam, layer after layer of molten steel, until the air shimmered with heat. Hours passed. The inspectors watched, grim and silent. Finally, as the last weld cooled, Ellie stepped forward and struck the steel with her hammer. The sound rang solid, no crack, no echo of failure. She turned to the crew, voice shaking but strong. "We just proved something today, that fear breaks before we do." Jack looked around at the exhausted, grinning faces of his crew. The ship was holding. They hadn't broken. Not yet. The third dawn broke over Richmond like the breath of a sleeping giant. The bay shimmered with fog, and the shipyard stood in near silence, not from rest, but from the sheer exhaustion that had hollowed everyone out. 3 days, 72 relentless hours. They had worked through storms, fire, failure, and pain, yet the battleship now stood before them, complete. Jack could hardly believe it. His hands, raw and blistered, trembled as he touched the cool steel of the hull. Every seam, every weld, every inch of this ship carried the sweat and determination of hundreds who had refused to surrender. Ellie stood beside him, eyes red from sleeplessness, her voice soft. "We did it, Jack." He let out a dry laugh. "Did we?" I keep thinking I'm going to wake up back on day one. She smiled faintly. No dream ever hurt this much. The Navy inspectors arrived early, flanked by photographers and government officials. They walked the length of the ship, clipboards in hand, testing every section. The tension in the air was suffocating. A single flaw could unravel everything. Jack and the crew stood waiting, silent and anxious. Luis, his hand still bandaged, crossed himself under his breath. If this ship floats, I'm taking my kids fishing for a week straight. When the lead inspector finally turned to Ellie, his expression unreadable, she braced herself. Well, she asked quietly. He paused, then nodded. The ship passes. She's seaworthy. The words hit like a thunderclap. For a moment no one moved. Then the yard erupted in cheers. Helmets flew into the air, torches were raised like victory flags, and grown men wept openly. The impossible had been done, a full-scale battleship assembled in just 3 days. Reporters swarmed, scribbling frantically, shouting questions. One asked Ellie, "How did you manage what no one thought possible?" She took a deep breath. "It wasn't me," she said. "It was them. Every welder, every worker, every dreamer who refused to give up. This ship isn't just steel, it's proof of what Americans can do when we believe we can." Jack looked out over the bay, where the ship glistened under the morning sun. For the first time he allowed himself to feel it, pride deep and pure. Luis elbowed him lightly. "You think they'll name her after us?" Jack grinned. "They already did. She's called Liberty." In the months that followed the launch of Liberty, the world changed, and so did the people who built her. The ship became a legend almost overnight, a symbol of American determination broadcast across radios and splashed across newspapers. But for those who had lived it, the sleepless nights, the burns, the fear, the victory carried a quieter, deeper meaning. Jack stayed on at the Richmond yard, though everything around him felt transformed. Where there had once been chaos and uncertainty, now there was rhythm, efficiency, and pride. Welding, once seen as a gamble, was now the cornerstone of modern shipbuilding. Entire training programs sprang up across the country, teaching men and women alike the art of fusing steel with fire. He watched as new workers arrived daily, women in overalls, veterans too injured to fight but still determined to serve, immigrants eager to prove their worth. The sound of their torches filled the air like music, a national anthem made of sparks. Ellie had been promoted, though she spent less time behind desks than anyone expected. She still walked the shipyard floors, sleeves rolled up, lending advice or a steady hand when needed. When the press asked her about her achievement, she always said the same thing. Innovation means nothing without people brave enough to try it. One evening, Jack found her by the water's edge, gazing at the ships lined up along the dock. The sky was streaked with orange, and the bay reflected the glow like molten metal. "You ever stop and think about it?" he asked quietly. "About what?" "That we changed everything. Welding's never going to be the same again." Ellie smiled faintly. "We didn't change welding, Jack. We changed how people think about what's possible." He nodded, letting the words sink in. Around them, cranes swung lazily in the distance, the hum of engines fading into the evening breeze. Soon Jack took on a new role, training young welders fresh from school. Many had never held a torch before, but he saw in their eyes the same fire that once burned in his own. He taught them what Ellie had taught him, that every weld carried a piece of someone's courage. And as sparks lit up the night once more, Jack realized that Liberty had been just the beginning. The real victory was in the hands that carried her legacy forward. As the war raged on, the shipyards of Richmond didn't slow. If anything, they sped up, fueled by the success of Liberty and the hundreds of ships that followed in her wake. But for Jack, the real battle was no longer fought on the dock. It was in the hearts of the workers who had built it, those who carried the torch long after the headlines faded. Jack often found himself at the war memorial downtown, staring at the names carved in stone, men who never came home. His hands rested on the cold surface, the weight of loss hanging in the air like a shadow, but there was something else there too, something harder to define. A quiet pride, mingled with grief. Ellie had sent him a letter once after the war ended. She had moved on, her role in the Navy's new shipbuilding division taking her to other places, other challenges. But she had made sure to write to every member of the crew. Jack's letter was short, but it was the words that mattered. "We built more than ships. We built the future. Keep it alive, Jack. Remember the sparks. Remember what we did together." Those words echoed in Jack's mind as he walked the shipyard one evening, now mostly staffed by new recruits. He saw them, young welders, eager but nervous. Some were fresh out of school, others were veterans who had returned to a different world. But each one had the same look Jack had had when he first walked through those gates: determination. Jack had become a mentor to many of them, teaching them the tricks of the trade. But more than that, he was teaching them something more intangible: the importance of their craft, the understanding that each weld, no matter how small, had the power to shape history. One afternoon he stood before a new ship, a hulking vessel that had begun its journey to completion. The torches hissed, the sparks flew, and the sounds of metal clanging echoed through the yard. Jack couldn't help but smile, watching the same passion in these young welders that had kept him going. Luis had retired a few years back, taking up fishing with his children as he'd promised. But every time Jack looked at the ships in the yard, he could almost hear Luis's voice. "This is what America looks like, hermano." Jack had learned that what they built wasn't just ships. They had forged a spirit, one that had outlasted the war and lived on in every spark that flew. And so the torch was passed, carried by hands that would continue to shape the future for years to come. Years passed, and time softened the noise of the shipyards, but not their memory. The war had ended, the factories quieted, and the once constant clang of steel became only an echo. Yet, for those who had lived it, those who had forged the ships that helped win freedom, the sparks never truly went out. Jack Thompson was older now, his hair streaked with silver, his hands marked by decades of heat and labor. He walked slowly through what had once been the heart of the Richmond shipyard. Grass had begun to grow between the cracks of the concrete, and the cranes stood like silent monuments to an era of purpose. But as Jack looked around, he didn't see decay. He saw history. He saw them. Ellie with her fierce determination, Luis with his endless grin, the countless faces who had given everything to something greater than themselves. At the far end of the yard, a new generation of welders trained at a modern facility. Jack had been invited to speak that day, to tell them what it meant to build, not just with skill, but with belief. As he stepped onto the small stage, the murmurs faded. He looked out at the young men and women before him, their protective helmets resting in their laps, their eyes bright with curiosity. "You probably think welding is about melting metal," Jack began, his voice gravelly but steady. "But it's not. It's about connection. Every seam you make holds not just steel, it holds trust. It holds the effort of everyone who came before you, and everyone who will come after." He paused, looking down at his weathered hands. "When we built the Liberty, we weren't just fighting a war. We were proving what ordinary Americans could do when they refused to say something was impossible." The room was silent. Jack could see Ellie's old words etched in his mind. "Innovation means nothing without people brave enough to try it." He smiled faintly. "So remember this, every spark tells a story, and someday your sparks will too." As he stepped down, the young welders rose to their feet in applause. Jack felt his chest tighten, not from age but from pride. Outside, the sun dipped low over the bay, reflecting off the old steel beams that still stood tall. The torch of innovation had passed on, but its flame burned brighter than ever. The legacy of the welders lived on,